Once upon a time, a long time ago in the village of Zorua, a woman named Amara had a big round belly. She was going to have a baby, but something was strange. Her belly didn't move like other pregnant women. No kicking, no turning, just heavy and still. The villagers whispered behind her back, saying her baby was sleeping too much, but Amara wasn't worried. "My baby is special," she told herself. She rubbed her belly every night singing soft songs, hoping her child would wake up and dance inside her. One stormy night, lightning flashed across the sky as Amara felt a deep pain in her stomach. "It's time," the midwife cried. The women gathered around her, bringing warm water and clothes. Rain poured heavily outside and turned her round like a wild beast. Amara screamed as she pushed and pushed, waiting for the sound of a crying baby. But when the midwife pulled out the child, the entire hut went silent. There was no baby. Instead, she held a small wooden coffin in her hands. Gasps filled the air. A coffin, an old woman shrank. What does this mean? The midwife shook as she placed the tiny coffin on the ground. It was made of dark wood, smooth and polished, with tiny carvings of faces on its sides. Amara panted, her body weak, staring at what had come out of her. "Where is my baby?" she asked, her voice shaking. The women backed away. No one dared to touch the coffin. Something about it felt alive. Suddenly, the coffin shook. A scratching sound came from inside. The lid cracked as it began to open inch by inch. The villagers outside heard the noise and rushed to the hut, peeking through the doorway. Inside the coffin, something moved. Then two tiny dark hands appeared. Pushing the lid all the way open, a strange baby sat inside. His eyes were as black as night, and his skin was pale, almost ghostly. He did not cry. He did not smile. He just stared. "My baby," she whispered, reaching for him. But the baby did not move towards her. Instead, he lifted his hand and pointed at the midwife. The midwife gasped as her body stiffened like a stone. Her eyes turned white and she fell to the ground lifeless. The villagers screamed and ran, knocking over baskets and tools as they fled the hut. But Amara did not move. She could not leave her child, no matter how strange he was. The baby climbed out from the coffin with slow, careful movements. His tiny feet touched the ground, and the hut grew colder. Amara watched as frost spread across the floor, turning the wooden planks to ice. The baby looked up at her, his mouth curling into a small, eerie smile. "Mama," he said, in a voice that was neither a whisper nor a scream, but something in between. Amara shivered. Her arms ached to hold him, but fear rooted her to the spot. Outside, the villagers gathered, whispering in fear. "That is no child," an elder said. "That is an old man." The chief of the village, an old man with a long white beard, arrived. He knocked his staff on the ground. "Bring the child outside," he ordered. But no one dared to enter the hut. Even the bravest hunters stepped back. The wind howled through the trees as the baby took another step forward. His tiny fingers curled as he pointed towards the doorway. Without warning, the doorway burst into flames. The villagers screamed and stumbled backward. "The child is cursed," someone shouted. The baby stepped through the fire unharmed, his eerie eyes fixed on the crowd. The flames died down instantly, leaving behind only a circle of ash. Amara followed, her heart pounding. She wanted to protect her son, but she also feared what he could do. "Please," she begged. "He is just a baby." But deep down, she knew he was something more. The chief raised his staff again. "This child cannot stay in Zorua," he declared. "He brings death and fear." Amara shook her head. "He is my son." But the villagers were too afraid. They began to chant, calling upon the gods of the land to take the child away. The sky darkened and the wind swelled. The baby looked up at the clouds, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he lifted his hands, and the wind stopped completely. Not even the leaves rustled. The silence was heavy, pressing against the villagers' chests. The baby turned his gaze to a young boy who had been hiding behind his mother. He reached out his hand, and the boy floated into the air. The boy's mother screamed, grabbing his legs, but it was no use. The baby's grip was invisible but strong. Amara fell to her knees. "Stop this," she cried. The baby blinked and the boy fell to the ground with a thud. He was breathing, but just barely. The chief's voice trembled. "This child is not of this world." He pointed his staff at Amara. "Take him and leave. Never return." Tears ran down Amara's cheeks. She wanted to beg to plead, but she knew it was useless. She picked up her son, who felt colder than ice, and ran into the dark forest. The villagers watched her go, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and relief. The moment she disappeared into the trees, they sealed the village gates. Amara walked for hours, her feet aching, her arms shaking as she carried her child. The trees whispered around her, their leaves rustling with voices she could not understand. "Where do we go?" she asked aloud. The baby reached for her face, his cold fingers pressing against her cheek. Then for a moment he laughed. That sent shivers down her spine. The coffin which she had left behind suddenly appeared at her feet. It had followed them. Amara gasped and stepped back. The coffin should have been in the village. Yet here it was, sitting in the middle of the path as if it had legs of its own. The baby reached towards it, his tiny fingers twitching. Slowly, the lid cracked open. Amara's breath caught in her throat. Inside the coffin was lined with red silk, but something moved within. A thick black mist slithered out, wrapping itself around the baby's arms. Instead of struggling, he giggled, his dark eyes glowing with delight. The mist twisted and grew, forming the shape of a tall, thin man with hollow eyes. His body flickered like a shadow caught between worlds. "You have finally arrived," the figure whispered. His voice was neither warm nor cold, but something in between, something that did not belong to the living. Amara clutched her child tightly. "Who are you?" she demanded. The figure tilted his head. "I am the keeper of the forgotten," he said. "And that," he pointed to the baby, "is my heir." Amara's stomach twisted. "He is my son," she said fiercely. The keeper of the forgotten chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "He was never meant for the world of the living," he said. "He was born to rule the in-between." The trees around them groaned as if they too were afraid. The baby looked up at the shadowy figure, his expression unreadable. Then he stretched out his arms. "Papa," he said softly. Amara wanted to run, but where would she go? The keeper of the forgotten knelt, placing a hand on the baby's head. "You are home now," he murmured. The wind picked up sweeping leaves into the air. "I will not let you take him," Amara cried. She turned and ran, her feet barely touching the ground. The baby did not fight her, but the coffin moved again, gliding beside them like a loyal hound. Amara felt her son's tiny hands pressed against her chest. "Mama," he whispered, "you cannot run from what I am." The trees ahead twisted their branches, bending into faces, faces that whispered her name. Amara, return. Their voices clawed at her mind, pulling her thoughts apart. The coffin floated ahead of her, blocking her path. The keeper of the forgotten appeared beside it, his hollow eyes watching. "He will never belong to you," he said. "Give him to me, and you may return to the world of the living." Amara shook her head. No, she held her son tighter. "I will find a way to save him." The keeper of the forgotten sighed, his form flickering. "Then, you will have to make a choice." He stretched out his hand, and the forest around them began to change. The trees turned into pillars of stone, the ground into cracked earth. Shadows slithered across the ground like snakes. Amara's breath came in gasps. "What choice?" she asked. The keeper of the forgotten pointed at her baby. "Return him to the coffin, and he will become what he was meant to be. Or refuse, and he will destroy you." Amara looked down at her child. His black eyes shimmered with something ancient, something not meant for human minds. He was watching her, waiting. "Do you want to go with him?" she asked softly. The baby blinked. Then slowly he shook his head. "Mama," he whispered, "I want to stay." Amara's heart ached. "Then, I will protect you." She turned to face the keeper of the forgotten and said, "You will never take him from me." The shadows around them trembled. The keeper smiled. "Then, you must fight." Before Amara could move, the coffin lid snapped open, releasing more dark mist. The mist formed clawed hands that reached for her, their fingers cold as death. Amara ducked and rolled, shielding her baby with her body. The mist scraped against her back, leaving behind a chill that seeped into her bones. The keeper stepped forward, his voice calm. "You cannot win." But Amara refused to listen. She dug her fingers into the earth, grabbing a sharp stone. If she had to fight, then she would. The coffin floated higher, the mist wrapping around it like a living thing. The shadows grew sharper, forming ghostly figures with empty faces. They reached towards the baby, whispering his name. "Come with us," they chanted. "Come home." Amara tightened her grip. "He is already home," she growled. She hurled the stone at the coffin. The moment it hit the coffin, let out a deep, echoing scream. The ghostly figures twisted in pain, their forms flickering like candle flames in the wind. The keeper of the forgotten frowned. "You are more stubborn than expected." He lifted his hand and the coffin's scream grew louder, shaking the earth. The baby whimpered and buried his face in Amara's chest. "Enough," she shouted. "If you want him, you will have to take me too." The keeper paused. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his hollow face. "A mother's love," he murmured. "It is a powerful thing." The shadows hesitated. The trees whispered and the coffin trembled. The baby lifted his tiny hand and touched Amara's cheek. "Mama," he whispered. Then his black eyes shimmered with light, soft, golden light. The darkness recoiled from it, the coffin shaking violently. The keeper of the forgotten took a step back, his expression unreadable. "What is this?" he demanded. But the light only grew stronger. The baby giggled. The sound filled with warmth. The coffin gave one final shudder. Then, with a great crack, it split into two and crumbled into dust. The keeper of the forgotten let out a sharp breath. "Impossible," he whispered. The mist around him faded and the ghostly figures vanished into the wind. The golden light swirled around Amara and her child, warming her skin. She felt lighter, stronger. The keeper's form flickered like a dying flame. "You have undone what was meant to be," he said. "But fate is not so easily changed." Then, with a final whisper, he faded into nothing. The forest was silent once more. Amara looked at her son. He was still her baby, but something had changed. His black eyes were now softer, now filled with warmth instead of shadows. "You saved us," she murmured. The baby giggled and reached for her face. She hugged him tightly, pressing a kiss to his forehead. The coffin was gone. The darkness had faded. But something told her that the world would never forget what had happened. Somewhere deep in the shadows, something was still watching, and it was waiting. Amara stood in the silent forest. Her son warm pressed against her chest. The golden light that had burst from him slowly faded, leaving only the rustling of leaves in its wake. She had won, or so she thought. As she took a step forward, the ground beneath her trembled. A deep guttural sound echoed through the trees. Something ancient had awoken. The baby stiffened in her arms, his fingers curling into her dress. "Mama," he whispered, his voice filled with fear. Amara swallowed hard. The fight was not over. The wind howled, carrying whispers that slithered into her ears. "He is ours," they murmured. "He does not belong to you." The trees bent towards her, their twisted faces watching with hollow eyes. Then, from the darkness, another figure emerged. It was not the keeper of the forgotten. No, this was something else. A woman tall and thin, her body draped in a black cloak that moved like living smoke. Her face was hidden beneath a hood, but her presence made the air heavy. Amara clutched her child. "Who are you?" she demanded. The woman's voice was like a sigh of wind through an empty grave. "I am the mother of the lost," she said. "And that child, he was never yours." Amara's heart pounded. "He is my son." The woman tilted her head, her hood shifting slightly, revealing her lips as pale as bone. "Do you truly believe that?" she whispered. "Or did you always know that something was wrong?" Amara felt cold fingers of doubt creeping into her mind. Amara said firmly, shaking her head, "He is mine. I carried him. I gave birth to him. The mother of the lost took a slow step forward. Did you? Her voice dripped with something poisonous. You gave birth to a coffin, not a child. The baby whimpered, pressing his face into Amara's shoulder. The woman raised a pale hand, and shadows swelled around her fingers. Give him to me, she commanded, or watch the world crumble beneath his power. The earth trembled beneath Amara's feet. Amara took a shaky breath. He is not a monster, she said. He is just a baby. The mother of the lost let out a soft, humorless laughter. You think love can change what he is? Her hood fell back, revealing her face of pure emptiness. No eyes, no nose, just a hollow void where a human face should be. He is an heir of the in-between. His very existence is a curse. The baby suddenly lifted his tiny hand and pointed at the woman. No, he said. The mother of the lost froze. The wind stopped. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. What did you say? She whispered. The baby pointed again. No, he repeated, stronger this time. A ripple of energy burst from his fingertips, sending the woman stumbling backward. Amara gasped. The ground cracked, and from the fissures, golden light erupted. The same light that had shattered the coffin now surged through the forest, pushing back the mother of the lost hesitated, her body beginning to dissolve. You do not understand what you have done, she shrieked. He was meant to rule the in-between. Without him, the balance will break. The golden light only grew stronger, wrapping around Amara and her child. The forest trembled, and the whispers of the lost souls faded into silence. The woman's form flickered like a dying candle. This is not over, she hissed. Then, with a final terrible scream, she vanished into the shadows. The wind stopped howling, and the trees stood still. The world was quiet. Amara collapsed to her knees, clutching her son tightly. It's over, she whispered. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't. Something had changed. The baby looked up at her. His once black eyes now filled with flecks of gold. He was different. Not just a child of darkness, but something new, something between worlds. Mama, he whispered, reaching for her face. His touch was no longer cold. For the first time, he felt warm. Amara smiled through her tears. You are free, she said softly. She rose to her feet. The baby nestled in her arms. The path ahead was clear, the darkness retreating. But she knew she could never return to Zorua. The villagers would not understand. They would still see him as a curse. We will find a new home, she promised. She walked forward, each step lighter than before. The coffin was gone. The shadows had been silenced. The night no longer whispered secrets in her ears. For the first time since his birth, the world felt normal. Days turned into weeks, and Amara traveled far from Zorua. She found a small, quiet village by a river. The people there welcomed her, knowing nothing of her past. She built a home, raised her son, and watched as he grew. He was unlike other children. Wiser, quieter, but no longer eerie. He laughed, played, and loved. But sometimes on quiet nights, she saw shadows flickering at the edges of the trees. She knew they were watching. Waiting, but it never came close. The years passed, and the boy became a man. He was kind and strong, loved by the people of the village. He had no memories of the coffin, the keeper, or the mother of the lost. But deep inside, Amara knew something still slept within him. He could see things others could not. He could hear whispers in the wind, and sometimes just before dawn, his eyes would glow. Just for a moment before fading back to normal, but she never spoke about it. One day, as Amara sat by the river, her son approached her. Mama, he said, his voice calm, I have to go. She looked at him. Her heart was heavy. Where? He gazed at the horizon. Where the trees stood tall and silent. There is something calling me, he said. I don't know what it is, but I have to find out. Amara wanted to tell him no, to hold him close forever, but she had always known this day would come. She nodded and said, Then go. Her son kissed her forehead, his hands warm and steady. He turned and walked towards the trees, disappearing into the mist. Amara watched him go, her heart both heavy and light. She did not cry. She knew he would return. He was no longer a child of darkness. He was something else now, something powerful, something good. The shadows would not control him. The world would not fear him. And deep in the wind, she swore she heard a voice whisper, "Thank you." As the sun rose, Amara stood and walked back to her home. She had spent years running, fighting, fearing what her child would become. But now, she was at peace. She had defied fate. She had proven that love was stronger than darkness. The village knew nothing of her past, but she would never tell them. But at night, when she lay under the stars, she sometimes heard the echoes of a coffin's lid slamming shut, and she smiled knowing it would never open again. Far away in a land untouched by time, her son walked deeper into the unknown. He did not fear the darkness, he did not fear the whispers. He had been born in a coffin, but raised with love. He was not a ruler of the in-between, he was something greater. As he stepped beyond the last tree, the wind carried his mother's voice to him. "You are free," it whispered. And for the first time, he truly believed it. Then, without looking back, he disappeared into the mist. Thank you so much for watching.